So imagine not having a job, having little to live for, absolutely no hope. Then along comes an offer to make some money and be part of a larger group. How can that narrative from groups like ISIL be countered? I talked about that with Bessma Momani, a professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada. I asked her if creating jobs would at least be the first step and help.
Absolutely. Jobs and any sense of belonging. In fact, one of the greatest ways of creating de-radicalization or preventing radicalization is really giving youth a sense of belonging. So we've seen, for example, that when young people are married, when they have a home, they have a job, they have kids, they have something to live for, they tend to not be attracted nearly as much to the kind of ISIS ideology. And again, that's back to the idea they have something to lose now. So we do know that is a part of the process of de-radicalization. There also has to be, I think, a recognition that that there are vulnerable youth who are, I think, searching for some sense of belonging, and one has to find a way to make the ideology of ISIS less appealing to them.
And can you do that with education? Because a lot of experts would argue if you have an education, you have a sense of awareness, you have probably more opportunities, more hope, and less inclined to be lured by extremist and, frankly, warped ideology.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, one has to point out that there are many educated people who have been attracted to ISIS ideology. It's really about finding the counter narrative. In other words, almost dispelling point for point all of ISIS's so-called narrative, which often appeals to this idea of come to ISIS territory and you'll be doing good, come to ISIS territory and we will create a new state based on equality, based on camaraderie. All of that is actually not the reality. It really isn't. And we've seen testimony of many ex-foreign fighters who've come back to basically say that the whole entire enterprise of ISIS is really built on a sham. So that education has to be based on evidence. And I think there are compelling narratives out there which will work towards countering ISIS, but we don't necessarily give them the megaphone. I mean, we in a sense, put foreign fighters who return in jail, which understandably, if they've been a part of a crime, is important for us to do. But we also need to expose ISIS. We need to expose it for the hypocrisy that it basically built its entire infrastructure on.
So, Professor Momani, how do we do that? How do we expose that?
Well, I mean, one novel idea is often taking these foreign fighters. We've seen this work in Denmark. Foreign fighters that return to the home country, put them on a speaking tour. They can actually be very persuasive to say, look, I spent most of my time cleaning toilets. I didn't actually fight. Second of all, ISIS fighters, there was hardly any equality. If you were a Bangladeshi ISIS fighter, you had less rights than if you were a European ISIS fighter. I mean, all of the point for point sort of narratives or propaganda that ISIS has, they need to be countered one-on-one. It's not enough to just, I think, focus on a military strategy. One needs to also think about a preventative strategy.
And how do you win the battle? How do you unify the international community to be on the same side on this?
Well, it really takes a concerted effort. It takes putting very prominent and sophisticated and smart Islamic preachers, for example, to do the kinds of conversations, having a very open dialogue with young people. I mean, it's not enough to tell them don't join. You have to convince them. Young people today are much more intelligent and sophisticated and don't necessarily have the same deference to authority that previous generations had. So it takes a long time, but I think it's an investment worth putting into, but we don't. I think governments don't put the kind of investment into preventative strategies and de-radicalization. And that is unfortunately something that is, I think, an easy thing to do. In many ways, it's a lot cheaper, than any bomb that could be dropped on ISIS territory. But it's also something that's harder to sell to publics. It's harder to sell to coalition, to many members of the international community who want to fight ISIS. Telling them to put money into de-radicalization and preventative strategies is very difficult to do.
We'll leave it at that. Dr. Bessma Momani, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time.